you know, two reels, and it moved back and forth, but it simultaneously usually ate the film as it would do it. So it was a dangerous thing to do in those days. You ruined the print every time you did it.
But I think that it's, you know, and also that something like the just the object itself of the remote control, and you know, the arguments that, you know, if you're in a relationship with somebody, who's got the remote control? It's a very powerful situation to be in.
I just wanted to raise one other issue in regards to 24 Hours Psycho, and that is that it's been compared, as some of your other work has, as a sort of extension of what Andy Warhol was doing with, say, something like Empire or Sleep. And I'm curious if that's true, and if there is something to that, if you would talk about that.
I could try and get away with that. I didn't know who Andy Warhol was till 1994.
After Hitchcock.
Yeah. I mean, sure, I think you have to also, I mean, I'm not going to play the naive card again, but it was very difficult as a student in Glasgow, or even in London. You could read about Sleep, and you could read about Empire, and you could read about, you could almost never see these things. The first Warhol film that I saw was My Hustler. I saw it in a toilet at a party. You know, I didn't pay that much attention to it, but I knew it was happening. And again, if I had the experience of watching Empire, maybe I would never have made this.
Oh, interesting.
It's fine, you know, it's one thing to read about it, but actually the experience and the kind of magic that, now I've seen Empire a few times, and the seduction that's involved with the event of seeing, I'm not going to say it's more powerful than the concept, but it's as a colleague artist, say, to someone like Andy Warhol or anyone else, if you're faced with the power of the seduction that someone else can use, it can certainly determine how you might go ahead with an idea or not. Okay. So maybe had I seen these things, I don't know if I would be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. Interesting.
Does anyone know what time the movie's going to stop upstairs? 5:30? Okay.
If it's really 24 hours.
Well, I have to. Well, I should come clean on this as well. Actually, you've got about 10 minutes left. When we started showing 24-hour cycle, it was never 24 hours because in Glasgow we didn't have the technology to do it. Because when we started to show, the idea was also that, you know, I was not very long out of graduate school, and the idea, it was supposed to be like a kind of a do-it-yourself DIY artwork, so anyone could do it. You just had to go to, you know, the local video store, buy a tape of Psycho or anything else, and watch it over an excruciatingly long period with all of your friends. The way that we could show it in those days was that we had to use a VHS machine, which was like the size of a small car. I mean, it was like industrial VHS. And the gear system that would turn the wheels that would pass the tape through the rollers was preset. So in reality, it was actually like 16 hours, 25 minutes Psycho, or could be about 28 and a half hours Psycho. But usually people had fallen asleep by that time, so no one really noticed. And it was only when we could get commercial copies of the DVD, so it was like an updated version of Do It Yourself. It was only when we got it on DVD that we could actually make it 24 hours Psycho.
Right. Okay.
Just to get it out on the table there. Yeah.
Well, it's actually a sort of a sidebar, but it's interesting that cinema runs at such different rates anyway, that silent film is almost always run at the wrong speed. They cranked it differently when they filmed it, so that sometimes the projectionist would have to adjust the projector. There was really no, you know, absolutely firm.
Well,
speed
most
for
people
things.
don't realize that the movies that they watch on TV are sometimes 10% shorter than what you see at the cinema. They're the same movie, but just shown at a different frame rate.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Well, this is a different film that you used, Taxi Driver, which you used for a piece called Through a Looking Glass. And in this work, you've actually taken a scene from the actual film, and in some sense, you've recreated that scene in the gallery space, because if I remember right, Robert De Niro is staring in a mirror when he does this sort of ad lib, which I think it was in the original film. So I'm wondering what you had in mind with this. Clearly mirrors play an important role in your work. The mirror's not really here in this, or maybe perhaps we become the mirror, or he's his own mirror, because he's projected on the other side in reverse.
Yes, a combination of things, I think. I should also say that of the movies upstairs, Taxi Driver, Psycho, The Exorcist, I was never allowed to watch these films as a kid. So their mythical status was blown out of all proportion to me. I didn't see Taxi Driver until I was, 26? I didn't see Psycho until I was, 22? The Exorcist I've still never seen. And these are all, it's like fascination with something, it's not exactly forbidden fruit, but the fascination of something that your mother told you was too terrifying to watch.
Yeah. You were forbidden to watch them, actually, in terms of the household? That these kind
Absolutely,
of
yeah, The Exorcist couldn't be on. It didn't matter whether I was watching it or not, the TV couldn't be on while that was being broadcast.
Right.
It's still the same.
My daughter was here last night for 24-hour access, and she saw an ad for The Exorcist recently on television, and it shows the difference in our cultures now between just a few years ago in Scotland and what's happening here now, is that she saw this ad. It scared her to death, just the ad. So she loves your work, but she would not go in that room.
Me neither.
I heard you say once, Douglas, that we're talking about the wrong piece, but maybe not. It's the same thing in some ways. That it's easy to let the devil in, but it's hard to get him out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, so Robert De Niro.
So yeah, when maybe the first time I saw Taxi Driver, I mean it's again kind of a little bit of chance that I didn't see these movies until I was quite a bit older than most people. So when I was watching them for the first time, it was there was definitely some kind of sense of a little bit of taboo being broken. And also, so then a fascination with almost every scene, because when you're told that something is too terrible to watch, it's a fantastic antecedent to how you're going to actually watch it, because you're expecting the worst. And when the worst doesn't happen after 5 minutes, then you become even more kind of irritated because you want to see something terrible. So I would watch a thing like Taxi Driver, scrutinizing each scene, desperately looking for something in it that wasn't there, which is how I make most of my work, actually, inserting things that are not even there into these scenes. But I think at the time when I was watching Taxi Driver, I'd maybe been reading, some Lewis Carroll. And, as I said earlier, I did physics at school, and I was always, as one of my science classes, and I was always fascinated by this beautiful idea of what makes a mirror. I mean, what's the difference between a regular piece of glass and a mirror? And in some senses, it's only the belief that it's not a piece of glass that makes it into a mirror. Because if you start to break it down into its components, then the magic of the mirror disappears. It's like in I can make a big digression here. I went to a conference on art and science about maybe in 1996, and a lot of the artists were interested in sensory deprivation and temporal deprivation, and we were speaking to scientists who had made experiments. Where a volunteer would go into a room where they had no natural light. They had no clock, they had no watch, they were given food whenever they demanded. So basically their idea of routine was completely askew. And the way that some of these people would do this for weeks. And there's a kind of a beautiful story. It could be a totally apocryphal idea. But one person claimed that when they came out of this state, they couldn't look through a window because all they could see was a piece of glass. And again, this is kind of the ideas I was thinking about with the mirror. If a mirror is a piece of glass and you don't allow yourself to fantasize about what this reflective surface is doing, it's only a piece of glass with a reflective surface. And something magic must happen between the surface of the glass and the silver. And wouldn't it be really great if you could expand that thickness in order to step in? I don't want to be on this side of the mirror or that side. I want to be halfway, to have 1 foot in the fantasy and 1 foot in the reality. And what I wanted to do with Through a Looking Glass was in a way to take the mirror that Robert De Niro is speaking into, which must be a 1/4 inch thick, and make it, say, 35 feet wide. So you're trapped in between the glass and the mirrored surface. And what happens in between that surface and that one is that things go kind of haywire. And that's when, he starts off, his monologue is a monologue. And as one starts to spin out of sync with the other and further, you can imagine that one surface of the mirror is in its own time, and on the other side of the looking glass there's another time frame. This monologue becomes a dialogue. So
it's interesting. It strikes me that in a weird way, that's also what you do with 24-hour Psycho in a funny sort of way, because there's this other world on the other side, but by manipulating it to a certain degree, it now becomes confused with this world, but not quite. It's still over there, so it's halfway in between. You're halfway there, but not quite, in moving from one world to the next. Now, this is a quite disturbing piece, I think, for some people anyway, and this is also about trading places, I think, or finding yourself halfway in between something. And this is a work most of you who've been through the exhibition probably experienced this, although it could be one of those rooms you walk by and you don't notice, too, very easily. In this work, 30-second text piece, actually, you're reading this text about a scientist who is conducting experiments with guillotined heads and essentially discovering that he feels there's life left in them for about 30 seconds after they're chopped off. And at some point, every 30 seconds, the light goes out for 30 seconds. And I'm curious how you came up with this idea, first of all, where you ran across this, and then if you could tell us just a little bit about it.
In the middle of the night, I was at home watching videos. It really is actually the same story. It's relentlessly the same story. Maybe the root of the work comes from, I was invited I think in 1995 to go to a place in Sweden, just outside of Stockholm, a place called Uppsala. And I was interested to go there because Ingmar Bergman had made a lot of movies there, or had made at least one classic, Fanny and Alexander. It was also a fantastically famous scientific research university. It's where all the kings of Sweden, I think, or maybe not all of the kings of Sweden, but they told me that they kept all the heads of the kings of Sweden in this palace. It's also the museum in Uppsala is part of an old palace which was Queen Christina's, and that was where Queen Christina was. There's rumours of ghosts, etc. It was right up my alley. But when we went to visit the museum for the first time, there was maybe 5 or 6 artists, all from Glasgow. We went to visit this place and we took a tour around the building. And the room that I was most interested in must have been at one time a much taller room, maybe I don't know, 25 or 30 feet high. And to make it into a cost-effective modern museum, they had split this beautiful big room into two. And where they had put in the new ceiling or floor for upstairs, they had chopped the head off an angel, which had been part of like a bas-relief panel on the wall. And maybe it was my old religion. I thought, you don't chop the head off an angel. So that, I was so kind of, really honestly, I was quite appalled by this. Something so pragmatic had ended up with such a, really quite a brutal image. So when I got back to Glasgow, where I was living at that time, I started looking into mythologies around decapitation. And I found a fantastic book on torture and death, which I just happened to have under the pillow. And there was this story of this Dr. Boriot and this criminal. The story that I read was a much larger story, and I just started to get fascinated. Of course, everyone would be fascinated by the idea that if you lose your head, you still have 30 seconds to realize that you've lost your head. And so what I did was to edit down the text until it took me about 25, what does it say? 25 to 30, yeah. 25 to 30 seconds. So I took something from someone else's archive and kind of re-edited it to suit my purposes. The first time I showed this, it was at the feet of the angel who had lost her head. But that was a bit tough. So the next time I showed it, I kind of got the angel out of the picture and simplified it to the form of the work that you see upstairs or don't see upstairs. Is the form of the work that eventually came out of this very long-winded story.
Okay. I'm going to move on, Douglas, because it's getting a little late. I want to have time for questions here. Maybe we could quickly discuss Croque-Mort.
Yeah. Does everybody want me just to speed up? I can tell fast stories or slow stories. Croque-Mort, these are photographs of my niece. And the photographs were taken 9 months after she was born. And that was a kind of a happy coincidence, but I liked the idea that she was a mirror image in age than the point at which she was conceived. So she was as long in the world as she had been out of the world. This series of photographs was taken, I think, around about the time when I also, had fallen and cracked my head. And I was sitting in a bar in France, and I was telling another artist that I couldn't remember anything about what had happened to me. And when the neurologist had done his examination on me, we did CAT scans and MRIs and everything to see if there was going to be any future problem. But one of the most basic tests was that, he took the end of his pen and just ran it up and down the soles of my feet. Just a very basic reflex test. And luckily, I felt what he was doing and I was allowed to leave. But I was telling this other artist, a friend of mine, and he said, oh yeah, but this is a very common thing that morticians do, or used to do in France. This is why a mortician in France is called a croque-mort, which kind of, I suppose, means to bite death. That during especially when France was involved in all these huge Napoleonic wars, that the morticians would be on the battlefield after the battle, and they didn't have time to make a real diagnosis of everyone. So they would bite the feet of people lying on the battlefield in order to determine whether they were dead or alive. So I thought, that's kind of a funny story. And I went back to my hotel that night and I'm like, geez, I used to be able to do this. And I honestly, genuinely remembered that, of course, I used to be able to do this, and I'd seen other people doing it, and then I thought, yeah, but babies do it too. And I kind of, again, had this fantasy that my niece being as long in the world as out of it, that her biting her toes could almost be read as her testing to see if she was really here.
Mm-hmm. So it's a piece about death and birth and life and death in the same piece, the same person. Why the red, by the way, Douglas? Is that a womb-like
Looks
thing,
like
or?
it to me. I don't really know. Well, the first time I showed it, it was at Gagosian Gallery, I think, and
Yeah.
I wanted Larry to paint the gallery red, just to see if he would do it.
And to see if we'd do it here too, huh? We fell for it. Okay. Why are they so low? So kids can see them.
That's a good answer. Yeah, so kids can see them. They're also, to be honest, they're also that the center of the picture is around male and female adult genital height.
That's the other answer. In this work, Déjà Vu, pretty spectacular piece. What's happening in this is, this is a film from 1950, DOA, Dead on Arrival, classic film noir to some degree. And the center projection, if I understand this correctly, is running at 24 frames a second, which would be the standard for sound film. The left screen is running at 23 frames a second, and the right screen is running at 25 frames a second, meaning that as the film moves on, it's going to get more and more out of sync.
Just exactly what Kerry's saying, but I'll go back and tell you why this piece came about also. That I was working on another piece called feature film, which is not in this show. But that piece involved an orchestra playing the soundtrack based on sheet music to Hitchcock's Vertigo. However, when we had to do this, we were making the recording in France, and in Europe, most sound film these days is run at 25 frames a second. Whereas in the UK and in the States, it's 24 frames a second. So a 24th of a second really is not a great deal until you start to add up how many 24ths of a second a difference can make. So when we were working on feature film, we were watching Vertigo at 24 frames a second, and the orchestra were playing at 25 frames a second, and it was like a disaster. However, out of that disaster, it became interesting to me that if a 24th of a second can make such a difference, what do we do if we make it 23 frames a second? So the screen, or actually the screen on the right is at 23 frames a second. The screen in the middle is 24, and the screen on the left is 25. So I had this idea that let's start everything absolutely together, and let's see, it's taking an infinitesimally small amount of time and showing that it's almost like some kind of an analogy to the fact that if you don't notice the difference a small thing can make, here's what can happen when those small things add up and conspire together to make something else happen. So within seconds of these three films starting at the same time, they start to run kind of at odds with one another, because not only are you seeing the same thing over and over and over again, then you get into the story of the movie, which is that Edmund O'Brien arrives, and he says that this is right at the beginning of the film, so you hear him saying, "I want to report a murder, mine," and you go, okay. Then he says a couple of seconds later, "I want to report a murder, mine." Then he says it again, and you realise that what you're bound to watch here is maybe in some way, again, analogous to the state of mind of the character, because he knows he's dying, and we know he's dying, and again and again. So even once he's died once, you know you have to watch it again, and then he dies twice, you have to watch it again. By that time, the first one's going to start again. So you're kind of, again, trapped in this relentless retelling of the same thing. And the whole story in DOA is that he's trying to find out how he was murdered. And the more he finds out about it, the more tragic it gets.
"3 Inches Black." This is a piece that really has a lot of linkages back to your youth, I think.
Yeah, again, I'll try and be kind of quick. 3 Inches Black was done kind of it was a kind of a challenge in a way that someone in Paris wanted to make an exhibition, and I thought, okay, I'm going to think up the toughest project I can imagine for them to do, and if they can do it, I'll work with them, and if they can't do it, I won't. So I was sitting with the people from the gallery, and as we're talking about what we might do, I start to colour my finger black. And I said, do you think you could find someone who could tattoo this on them? And they were like, oh, I don't know. So they did find someone who volunteered to have his finger tattooed. And neither he nor they asked me any questions about it. They just, said, okay, we'll do it. And I was like, are you mad? You don't even want to know why? So the story behind this is that when I was a child in Glasgow, growing up in the late 60s into early 70s, at that time Glasgow had a bit of a reputation for being a kind of a tough place. Knife violence, or violence with blades, was very prominent in the news. And I had this vague memory of, a friend of my mum's kid or something had been arrested for carrying a steel hair comb. Maybe it was a little sharp at the end, who knows. But he had been arrested for this. And so this was one of the things that you grew up with as a child in Glasgow, that the police could stop and search and arrest you if you were found with an instrument, a sharp instrument, 3 inches or longer. So obviously this got into my head, and I kind of got fascinated with 3 inches. And I was like, what's the significance? And I was living in Germany at this time, and I was bored.
Okay. Right.
And I started measuring different parts of my body. And luckily for me, I came up with my finger being 3 inches long. And I kind of was like, well, maybe it's only me. And so I phoned a friend of mine and I said, hey, how long's your finger? And he's like, oh, it's about 3 inches. And I said, oh, good. So it seems to be that most men's index fingers are about 3 inches long. And so, of course, when I took that nugget of information and inserted that into this story that I just told you, it became kind of beautiful and kind of explicitly horrible at the same time. That to carry a sharp object around with you, which is 3 inches or longer, is one thing, but to be conscious of the fact that the length of your finger is all that it takes to penetrate the body to a fatal effect became something much more interesting to me. So by marking this out in your body, it was in a way a gesture of admission for this man in Paris to carry around this mark, so that when people asked him why this, he could tell them this story. Or he could say, this is the distance needed to reach into your heart. So, he could play the romantic or the diabolic at the same time. And I was kind of interested that a certain part of your body could become a storytelling object, which is almost, it then became independent of your body in a way. Do we want to open it up for questions kind of like now? I mean,
Do you want to do that?
Maybe.
Okay.
I mean, if people want to ask anything while we're going through this, that might be a good.
I was wondering if you had thought a lot about racial implications of race as well.
I mean, I don't know what the implications are, but I was certainly.
Does anyone hear the question? Yeah. The question was, were there racial implications from other people in terms of 3 inches black?
Was I aware of the racial implications?
Or aware of them?
As I said, I wasn't. I was aware that there would be, there could be a reading of it based on a racial context. I don't know what the implications would be. What I also was aware of in terms of art history, and I should have done my research on this. There's a group of paintings, I think late Renaissance paintings, of doctors who grafted Negro limbs onto white bodies and white limbs onto Negro bodies. So for me, there was enough of an art historical precedent to ground it in that. These guys were made into saints for that work, which I thought was kind of a curious idea. But I don't. What would you think are the racial implications of the work?
Well, I think it's interesting that it's something kind of violent that you're talking about, and then of course there's all of these stereotypes put on black people or black men in particular about violence, and then particularly sexual violence, and this thing where it can be violence of malice or ignorant or whatever. So I think there's a lot there that you're bringing up.
I mean, as I said, I mean, I was aware that it could be read on a level of an interpretation which could be to do with race, but certainly when we showed the piece first in Paris, a lot of people interpreted it much more to do with the idea of disease. And the disease related to maybe not sexual violence, but sexual activity. That was something that in my naivety I hadn't kind of anticipated.
I think we can just open up for more questions now. Maybe if someone has a question about some of the other pieces in the show too, Play Dead or Between Darkness and Light. Great. Questions? Yeah, why don't we bring the lights up?
One of the things that, for example, this finger piece and other pieces, we decided, I guess, not to put labels up with any explanation. And I wonder what your feeling is. You could have had text and you used that. Why do you say something for us about not knowing the story?
I mean, I kind of feel that sometimes when we show this piece, there is the story, and sometimes not. And I think that I like the idea that people might encounter work more than once. Again, this might be a naive hope that people maybe see work more than once. But I like the idea that there can be a mythology that grows up around the work. There's always a mythology around an artwork. Whether it's someone who knew the artist and passed the story on to their family and that got passed on to someone else, there's always a mythology that grows around artworks. And I'm interested in that mythology. I'm not interested in necessarily being the one who starts it off or controls it. So, in a way, knowing that we were going to do a talk like this, I thought that maybe it's not so interesting, actually, for me, if we identify all those little nostalgic tales behind each piece of work. I can say them in a context like this, and then maybe from here it'll, well, let's hopefully say that it would ripple from here out so that the next time I do a talk like this, someone might contradict me and say, no, wait a minute, this is not the story I heard. And I like the idea of the conflicting story. So, yeah. Or not even more open, as I say, sometimes we will have the story, and sometimes not. So it's actually a kind of deliberate courting of possible conflict again.
Yes?
The fly, the image of the fly, I was very wrapped up in it, and I don't understand even myself why I'm so intrigued with it. But where did you find that image of the fly? Did you take that photo?
There's two stories to this. One is that I was in a flea market, and I'd found a box of stuff, which was, just old flea markets in Glasgow. You'll find all this really crazy stuff. And I'd found a box full of things like, old microscopes and test tubes and things, and it was like a school science department that had obviously, and within all of that I found these tapes of experiments that kids had done, and one of these was an image of this fly. So that was a lie, but that was the lie that I put out when I made the work in 1997 or 8. The truth of it is my dad ran around my back garden and caught these flies for me, and I glued them onto a piece of board and had my assistant film them, because I thought, again, it's being brought up on, actually there was an article in the New York Times today where the guy who's the producer of The Sopranos has said he'll never make TV again. He's only interested in cinema, and that cinema is like a cathedral. So being brought up with this idea that cinema is it's a beautiful, communal, almost a spiritual experience, I thought, let's make something really pathetic. No, but in a really sincere way. Like, let's look at the most pathetic, insignificant thing, the death of a fly. Hands up who's not killed one. Most people have killed them. And I thought, let's make a kind of a little cinematic memorial to the most insignificant death. That's true.
Questions? Yes?
It's called Guilty, and I like that. It sort of makes the film sense, lots of reflection on guilty. I was just wondering if the director of Memento saw that piece.
Do you know, again, I know I said that artists will always backdate their work a little bit, but that one's not backdated. When I saw Memento, I was really kind of shocked. I thought, yeah, somebody's read my catalogue. But this was done, it was specifically done, it was actually an instruction before it became a tattoo. I made, it was around the time when I was making these letters that I was mentioning. This was just after graduate school, and I didn't have a lot of money to produce things, so if I had an idea that I couldn't produce, I would just write out an instruction for an artwork to be made. And this was an instruction for basically anyone who really wanted to have this, I made the typography, I designed it. That would have been maybe 1993 or something. And then this friend of mine, who's a novelist in Belgium, he asked me if he could do it, and I said, well, buy the instruction and then you can do it. And that's, so he has it on his back. I don't know when he'll sell it, that's another.
Yes?
I have a question about 24-hour Psycho. Has it ever been shown, not for its entire length, but so that the opening and closing times of the gallery have actually made a portion of the art not exist to be used?
Most of the time, in the same way that, apart from yesterday and today. In fact, this is something that I don't know if we ever discussed this, about what happens when the Hirshhorn closes at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. Because when it comes to, these issues are kind of important, but at the same time, and especially because I've shown this piece so many times, I say to people, listen, if you want to switch it off, switch it off. If you want to keep it going, keep it going. Because there's always people who are determined to come and see the shower scene. And I always like frustrating those people. So it's like, if someone says, Go at 4 o'clock. I saw it at 4 o'clock yesterday. I like the idea of people going, they just missed it.
Yes.
So, yeah, Between Darkness and Light is the film using The Exorcist, the film I've never seen. And do we have time for me to tell the full silly story?
Depends on
So, I mean, again, this is a really, as I said to Kerry earlier, it's a combination of chance and chance. That I was supposed to show 24-Hour Psycho in Paris about 7 years ago. And as usual, Paris was on strike. And it was freezing cold, and so the museum had closed down. But we still wanted to have a party. So this was at the Centre Pompidou. And I said to them, look, come on, I've been here for 2 weeks. I want to have some party. So they said, okay, here's your budget for your party. So they gave me some francs at that time. And I went down to the local video store and I thought, okay, I'll just buy some, we'll just watch anything. And as I was looking along the shelves, I came into the religious section, which I usually don't go into. But I saw The King of Kings, which I love that movie. So I see The King of Kings and I thought, why don't I show The King of Kings with The Exorcist? I love this film, I'm terrified of this one. Maybe I can use one as an excuse to watch the other. But then I didn't have enough money. So I ran back to the Pompidou Centre, got some more money, I came back and someone had just bought The King of Kings. And
Mel Gibson.
Yep. I told you someone would say. So, desperate for something else, I found the Song of Bernadette, which I had also never seen. And I was looking at, the little synopsis on the back of one movie and then on the back of the other, and I went, no, this is too spooky. So we tested it out. I mean, it was done initially as a kind of a party thing. And then as the party went on and people started to leave looking very depressed and upset, I thought, okay, we have something. But because of my background and a certain kind of a residual superstition, I find it very difficult to watch it. And that's kind of made even more traumatic for me because I should say actually that these films are never initially, or were never intended to run in synchronicity with one another, in sync with one another. It's really down to whoever happens to go into the gallery and switch things on. So on a Tuesday, someone may switch on The Exorcist first, forget about the other one, go do something, and then switch on Bernadette an hour later or something. So they're never, whatever you see one day, you'll probably never see the same combination of images. And if you do see the same combination of images, but strange things started to happen where, when I showed it properly for the first time, the telephone would ring in The Exorcist, and someone would wake up in bed in St. Bernadette, as if to answer the telephone. So,
We've got time for one more question. If there is one. Yes, back there.
Can you talk about the elephant?
Great. Perfect.
that's going to require a long answer.
It's a mini answer.
It's funny you should ask that question because it's honestly the one that I don't have any funny story about. And I woke up one morning and thought, I think I'll make a film of an elephant. And I'm really still trying to figure out why I did it. Honestly. It was funny because I've only installed it once before, which was in New York, and it was on its own. And so this is the first time it's been seen in the context of my other work. And it wasn't until I think maybe the last day of installation I'm walking through the space, seeing the elephant falling down. Actually, I would have said lying down before, but now that it's in context of this, the rest of the work, it feels more like she's falling rather than lying. And then I walk into the other room where there's the man falling down. And I'd never seen the relationship between the two. And that's how naive and silly I really am. But I'd never seen a relationship between these things, and it's one of the things that's good for me about making exhibitions, is that you have to reflect on the things that you didn't see coming right round the corner, literally like right round the corner.
One thing I thought was that giving that beckoning finger, and after you sit with the elephant long enough and watch its trunk, it felt like another finger.
Funny you should say that. I can finish now on a high note, because there's the other piece which I was going to say to Kerry. Kerry asked me what I do when I'm bored. And there's another work in the show that you might have seen called Blue. Have you got that on there?
This is a high note.
This is a high note. And Blue is the kind of...
I don't know if we have it. Let's see.
Some people think it's like an erotic video, but I wouldn't know since I've never seen one.
I think Ned maybe took this one off my screen.
But I had been living in Berlin, and I was really bored, and I don't know, maybe it was around the time when I was measuring the 3 inches or something, but I started to make this other video of kind of one hand manipulating the other. And if you've seen it, you'll understand a comment that my friend made. He was watching this video and he said, "Jesus, Douglas, the longer you look at this thing, it starts to look like a finger." That's the high note.
Thanks, Douglas.